believed that to a large extent this horrible practice belonged only in the past. But several of our witnesses today will tell us of having seen it firsthand, having spoken with slaves as well as with their slave masters. According to accounts by anti-slavery activists, including some of our witnesses today, chattel slavery in Mauritania and in Sudan is substantially identical to slavery as it was practiced in other centuries. It represents the subjugation of one race by another, or often members of one religious group by members of the other. It frequently includes the grossest forms of degradation of women and children. Slavery is not to be confused with similar institutions such as serfdom or indentured servitude. However wrong these institutions are, they involve only the ownership of one person's labor by another. In true slavery, the heinous practice of slavery, as we will hear is being practiced today, the master owns the slave's body. He owns the right to decide whom the slave will marry. When babies are born, the master owns the babies and can buy and can sell them. True slavery is about treating people as though they were not people, as though they were things without souls. We will also hear today from former Congressman Mervyn Dymally, who represents the government of Mauritania. I understand that Congressman Dymally will testify that slavery no longer exists in Mauritania, or at least officially, and that the government is doing its best to eliminate the so-called vestiges of slavery. We will clearly give him a respectful hearing, but we will also ask him how he responds to the specific charges of people who say that they have seen slavery firsthand. The civilized world owes a debt of gratitude to the modern anti-slavery movement, some of whose leaders are here today. I would also like to personally thank Barbara Ladine of the Independent Women's Forum, who has been tireless in bringing the attention of official Washington to this issue. In the modern world, we often speak of fundamental human rights. Sometimes we say these words without thinking about what they mean. I believe that the idea of human rights has meaning only if rights are God-given, inalienable, and indivisible. Slavery is the ultimate denial of all of these rights. Toleration of slavery, even when it's far away and in another country, is the ultimate statement of radical cultural relativism. We must do whatever it takes to abolish slavery, not only because its victims are our brothers and sisters, but also because as long as there is anybody in the world who is a slave, none of us is truly free. I'd like to ask the distinguished chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Africa, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, if she would have any opening remark.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm glad that our two subcommittees have been able to work together to bring public attention to the persistent reports that slavery does indeed continue to exist in Mauritania and in Sudan. Slavery, what a shocking topic for a congressional hearing in 1996. We think about slavery as something that we read about in history class, something that existed back in the distant past, something that belongs to a different era. The topic is one that you would think of as a subject for a historian society's meeting, rather than as a human rights issue of the 1990s. And yet, there are credible reports that slavery still exists and that human beings are still being bought and sold in Sudan and Mauritania. If slavery does indeed exist in these countries, then we must do everything in our power to bring it to an end. There can be no tolerance for slavery anywhere in the world. The United Nations reported over a year ago that there is information that shows a massive increase in the number of cases of slavery, forced servitude, slave trading, and forced labor in Sudan. If there is slavery in Sudan, then there ought to be international action, effective international action to impose severe and universal sanctions against Sudan. We should impose a broad range of sanctions against Sudan or against any other country that tolerates slavery or that engages in slave trading. With regard to Mauritania, the State Department's Human Rights Report seems to have changed dramatically from last year. For instance, last year's Human Rights Report on Mauritania reported that with regard to the camp for refugees in that country, quote, informed estimates are that 10% of the 80,000 refugees in campaigns are slaves, end quote. This year's report says nothing whatsoever about those slaves, as if they simply disappeared. Similarly, the report of the State Department states that, quote, tens of thousands of persons whose ancestors were slaves still occupy positions of servitude, unquote. I do not understand the State Department's distinction between being a slave and occupying a position of servitude, and we hope that that distinction becomes clear today. To say, as this year's Human Rights Report does, that these people remain in servitude because of their lack of knowledge about their own status is to confirm that they are still slaves and are treated as slaves by their masters. This is an important issue and one that deserves and indeed demands congressional action. I look forward to hearing from the Clinton administration and from the distinguished panel of experts that we have invited to share their expertise with us today. And I once again congratulate Chairman Smith for his cooperation in this hearing. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite and say how pleased we are to have Secretary William Twaddell. Mr. Twaddell joined the Foreign Service in 1969 and held numerous positions in the Persian Gulf area until he was appointed ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Mauritania in 1988. In 1991, he left the position to serve as Chief of Mission in Monrovia, Liberia, until 1995, and in August, he assumed duties as Deputy Assistant Secretary in African Bureau. Mr. Secretary, welcome to the subcommittees, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chairman, I'm here today to discuss with you the extent of our knowledge about a question of great concern to all who are interested in freedom and human dignity, the question of slavery today in Mauritania and Sudan. Our current views on this issue were submitted to the Congress last week in our country reports on human rights practices for 1995. In addition to the texts of the reports on those two countries, I request your permission to provide for the committee a longer statement on this question. Let me summarize, if I might, our main conclusions. Let me begin with Mauritania. Our human rights report for 1995, as Madam Chairman just quoted, indicates that, quote, such practices as coercive slavery and commerce in slaves appear to have virtually disappeared, and concludes, reports of involuntary servitude are rare and unconfirmed. According to the laws of that land, citizens of Mauritania are now both constitutionally and legally free. What is at question, however, is whether these constitutional and legal guarantees have been fully implemented throughout Mauritanian society. While there is evidence that the government of Mauritania has made progress towards ensuring the full emancipation of all its citizens, it is also true that we continue to hear reports that slavery exists. In reviewing this question over the past 16 years, since the decree of July 5, 1980, declaring the emancipation of slaves, we have noted a number of measures undertaken by the Mauritanian government. These include ordinances and regulations have been promulgated calling for the enforcement of that decree of 1980. Public education campaigns about the practice of slavery and the rights of freed slaves have been conducted throughout the country, including by radio. Beginning in the early 1980s and continuing into the 90s, there have been a number of cases in which judges who failed to apply the emancipation law were sanctioned or removed from the bench. A non-governmental organization formed in 1978 by former slaves has been allowed to work to inform the population about liberation and to assist former slaves in their problems with their former masters. The creation of two additional organizations in 1995 demonstrates both that the social consequences of centuries of slavery continue to be felt. It also shows that the government is not posing obstacles to these actions, seeking to remedy this deplorable heritage. Since 1980, we are aware of missions to Mauritania by 13 national or international organizations for the purpose of investigating the question of slavery. Nevertheless, we do continue to hear reports that slavery exists, not merely vestiges, but slavery itself. Journalists and other investigators have reported that sales of slaves continue. Sources have reported that not all Mauritanians are aware that slavery has been abolished. The government has been accused by some of being too passive in its efforts to educate the people concerning their rights and legal status and in enforcing its own laws. The American Embassy in Nouakchott devotes a significant portion of its time to following the question of slavery. We have worked with American and international organizations interested in this question and welcome, I underline, do welcome the opportunity to consult with them and share information. Naturally, wherever evidence of the continuing existence of slavery surfaces, we strongly condemn the practice. It is our hope that as Mauritania progresses, and in particular, as it develops and improves its economy, increased prosperity, literacy, and education will create conditions under which the vestiges of slavery will truly become only an historical memory. The fact that cases relating to slavery continue to be brought before the courts indicates that not all former masters have accepted the law of the land. We will continue to urge the government of Mauritania to exert additional effort and resources to programs designed to educate its citizens about their rights conferred by their own laws. Turning to Sudan, the United States is gravely concerned regarding the continuing pattern of gross violations of human rights in Sudan, including increased credible reports of slavery. For 12, now going on 13 years, Sudan has suffered the slow hemorrhaging of a long, bitter civil war. Human rights abuses related to the chaos and horror of war continue, but there is also a pattern of serious abuses associated with the government's attempt to subjugate opposition wherever it is found. One aspect of that campaign may be the taking of slaves by the Army of Sudan or forces under its control. In addition, all warring parties in Sudan continued the practice of forced conscription as a means of replenishing the ranks of their armies. The government of Sudan has denied that slavery exists and refused to investigate such reports or to cooperate with others seeking to do so. This year's State Department country report on Sudan includes a section concerning the persistence of slavery and the alarming increase in reports of the seizing of civilian captives, particularly in war zones. There were also credible but unconfirmed reports that women and children were sold and sent abroad to work as domestic servants, agricultural laborers, or sometimes concubines. In some instances, it is reported that local authorities took action to stop occurrences of slavery. In other cases, the authorities apparently did nothing. The administration has not hesitated to bring such concerns before the international community, and especially before the organs of the United Nations. In a November 28 speech before the General Assembly last year, Ambassador Madeleine Albright stated, quote, "The government of Sudan remains an egregious violator of internationally recognized human rights. Over the past year, we have seen increasing reports of slavery and forced labor of women and children belonging to racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. Since 1993, the United States has taken the lead in introducing resolutions on such abuses both in the General Assembly and the United Nations Human Rights Commission. We will do so again at next week's meeting of the Commission in Geneva, where we will again introduce a resolution on human rights in Sudan, including a provision regarding slavery in Sudan, as detailed in the findings of the Commission's Special Rapporteur. We continue to fully support his efforts and endorse his recommendation that monitors be placed in key locations to improve the quality of available information. There is no doubt that the human rights situation in Sudan continues to be appalling, and that there is evidence of the practice of slavery in that war-ravaged country. Unfortunately, the government of Sudan has not until now been responsive to the mounting international criticism. Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman, The situations in Mauritania and Sudan relating to the question of slavery are distinct. What is consistent, however, is the concern and attention the administration devotes to trying to bring the practice to light and to an end.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony. And without objection, your full comments will be made a part of the record. I have a number of questions, and I will yield to my distinguished colleagues for any questions that they might have. In reading over some of the other testimonies and in following this, as both the Congresswoman of the African Subcommittee and I have for some time now, and other members of this committee, including my distinguished colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, when I read how the country report suggests that it has virtually disappeared in Mauritania, and then we have testimony from Charles Jacobs today from the American Anti-Slavery Group that points out that as recently as 1993, the United States State Department estimated that up to 90,000 blacks still lived as property in Mauritania. And then we have testimony as well from Samuel Cotton from the Coalition Against Slavery in Mauritania and Sudan, who points out that the practice remains massive and rampant in Mauritania, and says that the testimony that he has gleaned in going there for fact-finding suggests that the charge that slavery is still a way of life in Mauritania has simply shifted from the overt to the covert practice. So while there are paper promises that abound and legal strictures on the books against the overt practice, it seems to have gone underground based on testimony and evidence that both of our subcommittees have received, and there's volumes of it. How does the State Department respond to that, especially in light of the idea that it has, quote, virtually disappeared?
Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairman, I do thank you for underlining the point of the apparent discrepancy between the numbers cited last year and in this year's report. As I was reviewing this material, it occurred to me that there is very plausible cause for confusion, and if I may, I would like to read the three operative paragraphs from this year's Human Rights Report concerning Mauritania, because it does, I think, go a bit to the point of that you brought up, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairman as well, chattel versus servitude. Mauritania has officially abolished slavery several times, most recently in 1980. Nevertheless, the legacy of slavery remains in its economic and psychological manifestations, and there are reports of persons continuing to live in conditions of involuntary servitude. Tens of thousands of persons whose ancestors were slaves still occupy positions of servitude and near servitude, although such practices as coercive slavery and commerce in slaves appear to have virtually disappeared. In most cases, those remaining in a situation of unpaid or poorly paid servitude do so for lack of better alternatives or lack of knowledge about their own status. Some freed slaves, haratin, have either stayed with or returned to their former masters and continue to provide labor in exchange for room, board, and other basic necessities. Others live independently but continue in a symbiotic relationship with their former masters, performing occasional paid or unpaid labor in exchange for food, clothing, and medical care. There are no reliable statistics for the number of haratins who continue to work for the same families for which they worked before the emancipation of 1980, whether as paid or unpaid labor. Reports of cases of involuntary servitude are rare and unconfirmed. I believe those are the two. There's another paragraph that addresses the question of custody and inheritance, but those, I think, accurately describe the situation that our staff in Nouakchott, as well as our researchers back here, describe the situation as of 1995.
Let me just ask you, how do you respond to the assertion that it has just simply gone underground, and that 90,000 people, I mean, if they were indeed freed, I think there would have been some evidence of that other than they're just because of a symbiotic relationship or some other reason just stayed with their, quote, masters. And what kind of reporting do we actually get? I mean, we've heard that the sale of slaves no longer occurs in the public square. It occurs behind closed doors, often in private residences and things of that kind. So, you know, that's certainly out of sight in terms of perhaps our investigators or our embassy people to ascertain the facts.
Well, in fact, we would welcome any indications or any evidence or any leads that we could pursue concerning the sale or the transfer of human beings. When we have asked some of those journalists and investigators for particulars that we might follow up on, unfortunately the particulars have not been forthcoming in a way that was timely or inclusive enough to enable our people on the ground, or indeed other international investigators, to specifically identify such an instance.
How many people do we have on the ground working on this at the embassy?
Our embassy staff there is greatly reduced from what it was a few years ago, but of Foreign Service officers, I believe we have 6 or 8. Of those, probably 2 reporting officers, the ambassador and 1 political reporting officer.
How many Foreign Service personnel dedicated to this issue?
I would say the ambassador, the deputy chief of mission, and the political reporting officer take this as a large part of their portfolio.
So the ambassador is going house to house?
The ambassador, when she has indications of such an instance, has in the past been available and prepared to go and pursue those lines of inquiry.
Can you tell the subcommittees why the Anti-Slavery International organization, the world's largest, or oldest, I should say, human rights group, was not allowed to monitor conditions in Mauritania? I mean, you made the statement that there's a seemingly openness on the part of the government to allow organizations, yet we know that several have been excluded from on-site investigations and reporting, which would obviously greatly assist our own government in its job.
I believe, Mr. Chairman, that Anti-Slavery International has been allowed to get on the ground, has conducted investigations. With regard to remaining to monitor, I'm not sure what their objectives were, but in fact, in 1992, the Anti-Slavery International did visit and conducted investigations in Nouakchott.
The key word is monitor. One-shot deals do take a snapshot of the situation, but much can be hidden and cloaked in those kinds of settings, which is why monitoring is so important, to ensure that they get an accurate, long-range look, especially since the 90,000 people, from your testimony, I don't still have a sense of an accounting for those people as to where they are.
Mr. Chairman, we would welcome, and in fact we have urged the government of Mauritania not only to receive these investigative groups, but to be fully cooperative with them. If Anti-Slavery International or others felt it worthwhile to create a permanent presence there, I think that is a recommendation that we could support.
You've testified that beginning in the early 1980s and continuing into the 1990s, there were a number of cases in which judges who failed to apply the new law were sanctioned or removed from the bench. How many judges were so sanctioned and removed from the bench, and how many, conversely, got no penalty or received no penalty or perhaps a slap on the wrist? And how do we define sanctions? I mean, what does the government of Mauritania impose on a judge who has not fulfilled the letter and spirit of the law?
Mr. Chairman, from my recollection, I believe that there are cited in various of the documents with the committee 3 or 4 judges that have been either sanctioned or removed from the bench for failing to factor the emancipation of 1980 into their decisions. I don't have the years, but I believe in our longer statement submitted for the record, there is reference to that.
So a number of cases refers to 3 or 4 judges?
These cases follow a certain pattern, and they have had to do with custody of individuals who a former master claimed to be theirs. This would be directly to the issue of chattel, or inheritance or transfer. These are cases that have been brought before the courts of Mauritania, have received publicity, and when the judges in those cases ruled, or seemed to be ruling in favor of the former master, those rulings were overturned and the judges sanctioned.
Can you tell the subcommittee how many judges were not sanctioned when they did not follow the law?
I believe that all others followed the law. These stood out because they were in contradiction.
Give evidence of that?
I will have to research that for you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have that in my questions and answers.
Who has standing to bring a case in the courts of Mauritania, and what kind of resources are requisite to successfully bring a case?
One of the most effective and active instruments is this group, El Khor, founded in 1978 by a former slave himself. He is active not only in publicizing the issues, but in bringing to the courts and to public attention instances where such challenges to the existing law occur. There are also provisions in the law of Mauritania that there be public defenders, but the mechanism of the state and the resources of the state are very limited. In fact, these non-governmental organizations are more active and effective in bringing such cases to the public.
Let me just ask one final question. Again, two of those who will testify, Charles Jacobs and I mentioned Mr. Cotton, both argue that slavery never ended in Mauritania, and specifically Mr. Cotton talks about how it has gone underground. Is it the State Department's testimony that that's not the case? Are you disputing that as a fact?
We are saying that such cases have not credibly been brought to our attention in recent years. We would very much welcome specifics of such allegations that we would join in others in investigating. Yes, indeed.
The distinguished chairwoman from Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony this afternoon. To continue with a line of questioning from Chris, when the State Department reports that people in Mauritania are living in a state of servitude because they do not know that slavery has been declared illegal, or they do not know that they are free to leave, would it not be correct to say that these people then are still slaves?
I think without doubt, psychologically, many of them have difficulty distinguishing between the condition that might have legally existed before 1960 or before 1980, when the manumission was the last time handed down. They are, however, free to move on to another life. They are, by the tests of the court, by the documents, the constitutional and legal body of the country, free to move and to seek employment or pursue their own lives.
But it remains a problem in Mauritania for a person to know whether he or she is not a slave. And if the problem is a lack of communication, would it have not been appropriate for the United States government to, in its foreign aid program for the country, to have provided assistance to the Mauritanian government or some other agency to make sure that every slave in this country learns of his or her emancipation? Is that something that you have been looking at, or with any of the human rights and democracy funds to the anti-slavery groups that are presently working there?
In fact, we have urged on a number of occasions that the government do more to publicize what is in fact its policy and its own law. At various times, the government of Mauritania has. Immediately after emancipation in 1980, for 2 years, the government of former President Haidala conducted radio broadcasts on a regular basis concerning the institution of the prohibition of slavery and the manumission. This was done in the languages of Hassaniya as well as the indigenous languages of of Soninke, Wolof, Bamana, and the Halpularin languages.
I'm sure the transcriber is going to have fun with that one.
I think it's in the statement. But
And for the human rights and democracy funds and the anti-slavery groups, would that have been a better way for us to have communicated with the individuals in Mauritania? What sort of funding do we provide for them? And doesn't the ending of slavery warrant a substantial effort on our part to support these anti-slavery groups that are working there with under great pressure?
We are constrained in what we have available to work with the government of Mauritania with at this point in terms of our bilateral assistance. But we have made a small grant that has enabled members of local Mauritanian human rights groups to have exchanges with Freedom House. This is the sort of interaction that we think is very useful for both institutions, organizations, and promotes the shared objectives.
I'm familiar with that organization. They do good work in many countries. And just one last question about Mauritania before I ask a few on Sudan. Given your conclusion that not only do the vestiges of slavery continue to exist in this country, but also that slavery itself may be continuing, what sort of diplomatic or other steps are we prepared to take to make sure that Mauritania ends slavery? Is the Clinton administration prepared to impose economic or political sanctions against this country if slavery is not ended, and ended in fact as well as in theory, and if not, why not?
Madam Chairman, there are a number of things we are doing that we intend to continue doing that we would urge the government of Mauritania to get more intensively involved in as well. We have talked about public education programs, and I think that is at the heart of what needs to be done at this point. We have talked about the need, as I mentioned to Chairman Smith, not only to receive international organizations interested in the issue of slavery, but if they would like to have a more permanent relationship presence, we would certainly ask the government of Mauritania to consider that. I think that might go a long way to assisting them in their campaign, as well as to assisting the outside world in its access to information on the issue. We've encouraged the government to give official recognition to El Khor and the other two more recent organizations, although they seem to operate completely freely without hindrance. They do not yet have registration as officially recognized non-governmental organizations in Mauritania. We have suggested as well that the government publicize the particulars of the judicial actions that were taken in such cases as I mentioned in those 3 or 4 cases of custody. Other measures, and I take this largely from recommendations of the World Bank and the United Nations Subcommission on Human Rights, that said that the long-term problem that you allude to, I think, Madam Chairman, of the state of people's minds, their perception that they may not somehow be wholly free, needs to be attacked on fundamental societal grounds. With regard to education, in fact, the government is doing probably the extent of its limited capabilities in promoting primary and secondary education. This obviously is fundamental to people knowing about their rights and their situation in their country and in the world. The other is another very long, tedious slog, and that is creating economic opportunities and a labor market that may provide viable alternative employment outlets for many of those who are in the servitude and semi-servitude condition that prevails today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Although I know my time is up, if I may just ask one question on Sudan. In your most recent human rights report that we've discussed, the State Department concludes that the cases of slavery in Sudan have increased alarmingly. What steps is the Clinton administration prepared to take to step up the pressure with this government, the Sudanese government, to take effective action to end slavery? If a country such as Sudan engages in slavery and the slave trade, should we not be prepared to lead the international effort to impose a total political and economic sanctions against that country, including trade embargoes, expulsion from the United Nations and from the World Bank, and measures such as those?
Madam Chairman, you ask what we are prepared to do. We, next week, will again take the initiative in pressing the United Nations Commission on Human Rights to thicken and create a greater facility to monitor the situation of human rights and slavery in Sudan. Currently, the Special Rapporteur is barred from being present in Sudan. He's been prohibited entry. He has encouraged that there be monitors set up in the 3 neighboring countries of Uganda, Ethiopia, and Asmara, Eritrea. We think that this would be a very useful mechanism to thicken our information, our knowledge of what the situation is there. We feel, not only by his absence, but since the 7th of February, by our own absence in our embassy in Khartoum, at a disadvantage in being able to effectively, intensively monitor the human rights situation. Regarding sanctions, embargoes, and the IMF, Sudan is at the end of the most recent decade of terrible civil war. Its situation of human rights is truly appalling. The effects on the civilians, population of 27 or so million people in the last 12 years has been 1.5 million killed, 3 million internally displaced, an estimated 600,000 in refuge outside the country. There have been numerous instances of atrocious human rights behavior on the part of the government of Sudan, as well as on the part of forces opposing the government of Sudan. It is truly an horrendous situation. I think any consideration of sweeping global actions really has to take into account the dreadful situation and the opposing forces of those fighting and wreaking on the civilian population the hardship of the last 12 and in fact the last 40 years in that country. It's not something that can be done uniquely by the United States. In fact, it's something that effectively has to be done by all of the international community. Lamentably, only the countries in the immediate sub-region have taken this as a particular undertaking and campaign. But as we will again next week in Geneva, try to raise it to the International Forum of the Human Rights Commission.
Just very briefly, if the gentlelady would yield, as you pointed out, Mr. Secretary, in your testimony, it is, however, only the government of Sudan and their forces that stand accused of engaging in the practice of slavery. Is that correct?
That is our understanding, Mr. Chairman, yes. And I believe the United Nations Special Rapporteur has prepared a report.
Mr. Johnston.
Outlines.
Mr. Twaddell, Islam is one of the great religions in this world. And I'd like to talk a little about the religious makeup of Mauritania first. It's called the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. What does the Quran say about slavery? Do you have any idea? And are there Muslims enslaving Muslims in Mauritania?
Mr. Congressman, I, at this point, do not believe that anyone is enslaving anyone, that the active capture of slaves, transfer, sale of slaves is a current practice in Mauritania. Regarding the religious composition of Mauritania, it is correct that it is an Islamic Republic. It is true that I would estimate 99% of the population espouse Islam. They brought the religion with them, or they converted hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I point out quickly that of the 4 or 5 major identifiable ethnic groups who claim parts of Mauritania to be their homeland all espouse Islam. There are Catholic churches that operate in Mauritania. They operate without hindrance. There is stern disapproval, however, if there are attempts at proselytizing practicing Muslims. But the practice by Christians of their religion in Mauritania is permitted.
As contrasted with Sudan, which is Sharia is the law now, is it not, that they all be Muslim and they all be Arabs?
Sharia is the law, as I understand it, in the northern regions of Sudan, but it is not being applied in many of the southern regions.
When do you equate conscription to slavery?
I would, Mr. Congressman, I would.
Then your report says the SPLA reportedly held thousands of children in camps against their will as a reservoir of recruits. So then you have slavery in the South, too.
I think you have me. I would consider...
It wasn't a trick question.
No, I realize I just was not very quick on my feet. I would consider it a deprivation of one's freedom, certainly that. I come back to the definition that we were working from earlier, however, that of chattel slavery, and that being the position of being bought or sold.
Let me follow up on the chairwoman's question about sanctions against Sudan. We have closed our embassy there, and our ambassador is now in Nairobi.
That's correct.
We have declared it a terrorist country. We have not broken diplomatic relations.
That is correct.
I'm not recommending it, but is that an alternative?
Under some circumstances, it could be contemplated. At this point, we have decided, after our grave concern, that that we not break relations with Sudan. We maintain relations, but just remove our people from their presence at the embassy in Khartoum. In fact, we do have relations. Ambassador Carney is in Nairobi, as you indicated, and he is our ambassador to Sudan. We would welcome changes on the ground and policies by the government of Sudan that would permit the return of our embassy staff to Khartoum.
Is there any, just following up, it's almost, Sudan is almost totally isolated now. On its east, Eritrea, Ethiopia, in the south, Uganda, have all broken diplomatic relations with this country. Is there a chance that with the help of the presidents of these three countries, that the OAU could work through the UN to have some type of an embargo, particularly through Port Sudan and the Red Sea?
As you know, Mr. Congressman, 6 weeks ago, the United Nations did pass a resolution that was at the instance of the governments of Ethiopia and Egypt in their complaint of the attack against President Mubarak in Addis Ababa last summer. The government of Sudan has approximately 2 more weeks to show that they are responding to the resolution and the instruction of that resolution of the United Nations, after which the governments that brought the complaint, their sponsoring organization, the Organization of African Unity, and the Security Council of the United Nations may again take up the issue of noncompliance and appropriate measures to be taken against the government of Sudan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. B. Redder.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your courtesy and my colleagues, since I'm not a member of the subcommittee and I need to get on to other committee business involving Taiwan. I want to express my appreciation to the 2 chairmen for their holding this hearing today and such an important and often overlooked issue. Your hearing addresses a gross injustice concerning the most fundamental of human rights of perhaps thousands of Sudan and Mauritania's underclass. It's hard to believe that chattel slavery continues to exist in 1996. Yet in this region of the world, some humans still clearly are considered property of masters and expected to perform unpaid labor. Mr. Chairman, I believe that the perpetuation of this phenomenon has been downplayed and neglected by both the U.S. State Department and the governments involved. I hope your two subcommittees will light a fire beneath the State Department and these two countries and report my resolution to the House floor for favorable action. Why is this appropriate? We constantly hear the euphemism that only vestiges of slavery remain in these countries. To me, that phrase has no meaning. Either slaves, regardless of their number, remain in these countries or they do not. We will no doubt also hear today that slaves choose to stay with their masters out of economic necessity. Are we expected to lend a sympathetic ear to such excuses? To do so would make a mockery of the principles of equality that our nation has for so long struggled to achieve. If I'm outraged about this issue, I think outrage is appropriate. The dearth of first-hand accounts of slavery has frequently been cited as evidence that this institution has all but disappeared. Do we really expect slaves to come knocking at the door of the U.S. Embassy to report their situation? Furthermore, have we historically interpreted the paucity of first-hand accounts from political prisoners interned by repressive regimes around the world to mean that political prisoners do not exist either? Certainly not. Numerous stories of slavery continue to filter through to Amnesty International and other human rights organizations. Other independent investigators, such as Sam Cotton, for whom we will hear later today, have labored hard to break the conspiracy of silence surrounding this shameful practice. Mr. Chairman, I introduced a bill last month, H. Con. Res. 142, regarding the human rights situation in Mauritania, including the continued practice of chattel slavery. My hope is to spur both Mauritania and, with your help, Sudan, to stamp out this heinous practice once and for all and to conduct vigorous prosecution of violators of existing anti-slavery laws. I also urge the State Department to be much more vigorous in pursuing reports of slavery in those countries and to regularly initiate contact with independent observers of the human rights situation there. Again, Mr. Chairman, I commend both of the chairpersons involved for conducting the hearing, and I thank your witnesses for their willingness to testify. As I said, I need to return to other committee activities, but I know that you're going to properly pursue this very serious matter. And Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairman, I thank you, and I thank the gentleman from North Carolina for giving me a chance to make this statement before I have to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Beretta, for your fine statement, and I'd like to recognize Mr. Frazier.
Mr. Twaddell, you testify that slavery has either been abolished or there are mere vestiges of slavery. Could you tell us how were the masses of these slaves, when were they emancipated? Was there some public pronouncement in the international press? And were they international observers? And where did it go? And how were their former slave masters compensated?
Mr. Congressman, there are probably three specific references to the ending of the institution of slavery in Mauritania in recent years. One is their own constitution at the time of independence from France in 1960. The next year, Mauritania adhered to the United Nations conventions concerning slavery and human rights. The most recent public statement was the July 5, 1980 proclamation of manumission by President Haidala in Nouakchott, Mauritania.
Mr. Twaddell, segregation has been ended in the United States many years ago by proclamation, but there's still vestiges of it. Are you prepared to represent, as a representative of the State Department, that slavery no longer exists in Mauritania, and simply because there were some high-sounding proclamations that there's no one being held in slavery in that country?
I'm prepared to cite, Mr. Congressman, as I did a few minutes ago, the language of our human rights report that was issued to the Congress last week, in which we talk about the continuation of instances in the tens of thousands of servitude and near servitude. However, we make the additional point that we have not seen evidence of the buying or selling of human beings and the practice of chattel slavery in Mauritania in 1995 or indeed in recent years.
But aren't you in fact double speaking if you say that there are vestiges of slavery, but we haven't seen evidence of the exchange of people for some kind of money or being treated as, we calling them here, chattel? The question I have to ask is the State Department making a statement that slavery does not exist in Mauritania?
When I say vestiges of slavery, Congressman, I am talking about servitude and semi-servitude. I don't think that is slavery itself. I think that's a vestige of slavery. It
Are
is
we
not
playing with
being
words?
sold.
Isn't this just a fancy way of saying that the State Department will not go out on the limb and say that there is no slavery in Mauritania, but perhaps there are people who work and don't get paid against their will?
I think that there are people who work and do not get paid. I think there are people who work for well under the government's indicated minimum wage. I call that servitude. I don't call that buying and selling human beings.
Just one last question.
As the chairman mentioned in his opening statement, there is a distinction between servitude and contract labor and chattel slavery.
Just one last question. Have you been to Mauritania?
I've spent 3 years there, 1988 to 91, chief of mission.
Are you, based on your time you've spent there, can you say today that slavery does not exist in Mauritania today? Forget what all you've read, what you've told me has been written. Does slavery exist in Mauritania?
I would feel very uncomfortable saying as a certainty that slavery does not exist. It is a vast country. There are parts of it that until the droughts of the mid-70s and 80s were totally out of the reach of the capital. I think it is very conceivable that the practice of slavery exists, continues to exist in very remote parts of that vast desert country.
Is the United States doing anything to encourage that country to abolish slavery?
Yes, we are, sir.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Funderburg.
Mr. Secretary, regarding your comment on underground slavery in Mauritania, is it not a severe indictment on the U.S. State Department and Foreign Service when officers can be working for years in a place and not come up with credible first-hand evidence or documentation of the evils going on all around them? I witnessed this type of blindness to reality when a dictator in Bucharest was killing people and destroying a society, and it was all conveniently overlooked. If the United States was really interested and really tried, don't you think it could get the evidence or would already have had the evidence?
I will repeat that we would be delighted to have a good lead, Mr. Congressman, and we will pursue it with whomever.
What are the Foreign Service officers doing there?
They're reporting on the situation they find on the ground, sir.
They must be blind.
Thank you, Mr. Funderburg. Mr. Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first of all commend you for both committees calling this very important hearing on the question of slavery in Mauritania and in the Sudan. I hope this hearing will be helpful in preventing further suffering, which has already reached massive proportions. This is at least the 5th hearing that I've been on dealing with the Sudan since I entered Congress. I had an opportunity to speak to Columbia University in May of last year on this issue of slavery. And on February 24th, 1995, I convened a meeting in my Washington office to meet legislature to legislature with the president of the Mauritanian Senate, Mr. Farber, who was accompanied by Mauritania's ambassador, Ismail Ayalha. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss our mutual concern regarding the continued existence of slavery in Mauritania. Mr. Farber remembers my work in the human rights violations and dealing with this whole question of slavery. He mentioned that I was not very popular in Mauritania. Thank goodness I don't have to run there. I informed him that I understand that slavery is against the law in Mauritania. They made that clear. But until the practice of slavery is stamped out, the Black Caucus and other members of this Congress will speak out against slavery. We cannot continue to condone slavery. It's time that the government really becomes involved in attempting to eliminate it. I just looked over some of my records and I had a floor statement on Conres 176. And this was a resolution expressing the sense of Congress regarding human rights violation in Mauritania. And that was on July 29th, 1991. And we talked about the problems then, 1991. Here it is in 1996. And we're still dealing with the question of whether it's overt or covert, whether it's state-sponsored or not state-sponsored, whether there are slaves or there are not, the fact that it's traditional rather than by law. And I think that unless the United States representative there is serious about trying to eliminate or push the government, and my purpose for meeting with the president of the legislature was to try to appeal to them that why don't the government take a more forceful stand? Why will the government say, well, you know, historically, people stayed. Well, after the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves stayed with the slave owner too, because they were not encouraged to leave. They were not assisted to leave. There was no place to go. But once the Freedmen's Bureau back in 1865 was established, then people did go because the government, it became a part of the government policy to see that the vestiges of slavery would be ended. You're not going to end the practice if the government is looking the other way of Mauritania, if they are allowing the so-called practices as practice is not legal. It's like cases are lost in Supreme Courts because you can have de facto segregation or de jure, and they're both the same result and are treated the same, whether it's de facto or de jure. You still have de jure slavery in Mauritania. And until there is a realization and our government takes a strong stand against it, sure, conditions have improved in Mauritania. You know, back in many years ago, in 1991, there were 200 political detainees who died in detention. Others died of starvation in detention, of illness in detention. Back in 1991, there were 500 prisoners who died, also died at another time in detention. You go back a few years earlier, they estimated in 1981 there were 100,000 slaves that could be identified in Mauritania. So yes, there's been some improvement, but there is not the determination to end the vestiges of slavery. And I think that until that happens, that our government should be forceful there and in the Sudan in work and in ending these vestiges. It makes no sense as we move into the 21st century that we're still talking about we're going to try to do it, or it's not as bad as we think it is, or it's something we're going to work on, or they're trying to do a better job. That's what we continually hear, and we will continue to press this issue until and to push for sanctions and other kinds of issues until the governments come around and say that we will try to really get involved in ending this. We had a hearing at the Congressional Black Caucus last year at our legislative conference on the question of slavery in Mauritania and in the Sudan, and there is a tremendous growing interest in this country, and I'm going to remain vigilant on this issue until we see it ended. I have no further questions at this time.
I want to thank the gentleman from New Jersey for his tenacity in keeping this issue before the subcommittees, before the Congress and the American people. And I would like to ask Eni Faleomavanga if he would take the chair. All of us have a vote. We have about 5 minutes, and then we will continue the hearing. Well, it will continue while the
All
gentleman
right,
is in the chair. Please take it.
Annie, as you proceed to the chair,
I'm sorry, have you had a
I'm
chance
going to have to run and vote as well, but I had 3 questions that I particularly wanted to ask, and I don't know that I'll be able to stay here and hear the responses. I would like to present them to Mr. Twaddell for his response at a later time, but I do want you to know publicly what those questions are. You answered yes to Congressman Frazier's question about the United States encouraging the government of Mauritania to eliminate the vestiges of slavery. I would like to know exactly what it is that the United States is actually doing. The second question I have is, what is the role of color in determining who is enslaved? And the third question that I have is, does the government of Mauritania, Congressman Payne mentioned the Freedmen's Bureau, does the government of Mauritania have the kinds of institutions established as the United States did in the post-Civil War era that were established so that those who had been slaves could find their way out of slavery and into some kind of mainstream living? So those are my 3 questions that I would like to have Mr. Twaddell respond to me in writing, please.
I could attempt to do that very quickly before you go to your vote.
I think it might be better, Mr. Secretary, that the gentlelady from Georgia will submit it in writing in a little more comprehensive way,
No
and then that
problem.
way you can respond a little better, if that's all right.
Thank you.
Right on.
Mr. Secretary, I'm sorry I came a little late, but I did receive the gist of your testimony, a very comprehensive one at that. You indicated earlier that you've spent 3 years in Mauritania. What years were those?
I arrived in September of 1988 and left in August of 1991.
So you pretty much are quite familiar with the landscape and the scope of some of the
Yes,
provinces and
it's
the
been
things
5.5 years since I left, but I knew it pretty well when I was there.
You indicated earlier that by description, and of course I don't want to get into semantics either, but I guess because of international standards, we have what is called as chattel slavery, and then you have servitude, and you have contract labor. Is this how they divide the forms of slavery that we currently have in the world today, or is it just a definitely distinction of these 3 different formats?
I think there is a definite distinction without trying to split hairs or become overly
Let me ask you this. Among the 3 classifications, as I had indicated earlier, which one was practiced by the U.S. Before the Civil War, if I might add, among the 3?
As I understand it, in parts of this country, slavery was practiced up until the Civil War.
Yes, was that chattel slavery?
That was chattel slavery, as I understand.
Okay, and that's the worst form.
That is the buying and selling of human beings.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disrupt your...
No, but I do think that there is a distinction between slavery, as it is commonly defined in the dictionary, and servitude that may have elements of either psychological or economic compulsion, but does not have behind it the force of law. Congressman Payne talked about slavery continuing de jure. Clearly, I would have to contradict him. It has been written out of the Constitution and in the 1980 Emancipation Declaration. De facto, servitude, yes, it certainly is a phenomenon. Is it a dreadful thing? Yes, it is. Is it something that we should encourage to have ended as rapidly as possible? It certainly is. Are there practical mechanisms to achieve that? I think there are things that we can urge the government of Mauritania to do with greater vigor. And some of those we may be able to assist. I would like to see the practice of servitude and semi-servitude end as well.
And I might add that on these 2 classifications of servitude and contract labor, certain African countries don't have this problem. I mean, they are not the only ones that have this problem. This is a worldwide problem. Am I correct in making that statement?
I think it occurs in many places.
And so, but really the essence of the concern, and I'm sure that the members of the committee have, and certainly this member, is in reference to chattel slavery. This is really where the concern seems to be quite paramount. And I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little further on your experience and being there previously for 3 years in Mauritania, what your experience was. I mean, did you physically see this, or was it just by matter of reports from the countryside, or was it by rumors, or I'm not quite clear on that.
In my time in Mauritania, and since, I was not aware of any instance of buying or selling of human beings. There were instances, as cited in the testimony, in which competing claims for human beings by former masters against former slave parents, usually for children, were brought to the courts. This is clearly evidence of the transfer or the possession of one human being by another. By law, it could not happen. However, the cases were brought to the courts for the disposition of the courts. So clearly, in people's minds and in the practice, in some instances, the phenomenon of slavery is still perceived to exist. Certainly in the parents who went to the court to claim their children, the perception of slavery was the point at case, the case at point.
Does this seem to be the perception, and maybe if you could elaborate for the record, you've indicated that State Department did submit the 1995 report on human rights, in essence, on Mauritania alone on the issue of slavery. Could you elaborate a little further on that? Was it specifically in your description or the State Department's position, where does it fall among the three categories that you've indicated earlier?
I could, I think, read three sentences from that report that would encapsulate it. The legacy of slavery remains in its economic and psychological manifestations, and there are reports of persons continuing to live in conditions of involuntary servitude. Tens of thousands of persons whose ancestors were slaves still occupy positions of servitude and near servitude. Although such practices as coercive slavery and commerce in slaves appear to have virtually disappeared.
I gather that the government of Mauritania absolutely denies any such claims that there's chattel slavery going on in Mauritania. Does this seem to be your impression by way of information given to our State Department?
I would let them speak for themselves, but I would point out that there are these instances over the last 5 or 6 years in which the government of Mauritania publicly challenged the decisions of certain judges that seemed to contradict the reading of the Constitution and the Emancipation Proclamation. In that sense, they certainly would have to acknowledge that there were challenges to this law as a case in point.
You indicated earlier also in your statement that the government of Mauritania is quite free to allow NGOs like Amnesty International, the International Commission of Jurists, the Human Rights Group on Edinburgh, Scotland. The government has been pretty free to allow these different organizations to come in and investigate or research or study or whatever the situation is with that, or
I'm a little reluctant to characterize it. I do know that there have been 13 that we have elaborated governmental and international non-government organizations that have been allowed to go to Mauritania to conduct discussions, investigations of the subject of slavery. I don't know if I would characterize that as completely open, completely receptive. One of your colleagues suggested that it might be more effective to have a permanent presence on the ground of an international organization. There are now 3 Mauritanian domestic non-governmental organizations that concern themselves with the institution of slavery's vestiges.
I think the concern that we have here, Mr. Secretary, and I no doubt never a question in my mind about your sensitivity to this very important issue. It's ironic that we're at the eve of the 21st century and we're still talking about slavery. And I think this is where the sensitivity rises with the members here on the committee, and seeing that certainly that our country should absolutely be at the forefront in seeing absolutely that to see that this form of you might say inhumanity be stricken from forevermore from this planet. And I think you can recognize the sensitivity why the members are so uptight about this, and hopefully that our friends from Mauritania as well as Sudan will have their opportunity to make their statements. And I really appreciate your coming forth and representing the administration on this important issue. I'm going to turn the time over now to the co-chair of our joint hearing this afternoon, the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you so much. Thank you for chairing the subcommittee in our absence. We thank the Secretary for his testimony here today, and for the members who were not able to participate due to other pressing congressional obligations. We will forward those questions to you. We thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
Now I'd like to call our second set of panelists, Mr. Samuel Cotton, Executive Director of the Coalition Against Slavery in Mauritania and Sudan; Charles Jacobs, Research Director of the American Anti-Slavery Group; Mr. Mohamed Nacir Athié, of the Executive Director of the International Coalition Against Chattel Slavery; and Mervyn Dymally, retired member of Congress. Please join us. And as you get seated, I'd like to read a short introduction for each. Mr. Cotton is the Executive Director and a founding member of CASMAS, the Coalition Against Slavery in Mauritania and Sudan. He has traveled across the United States speaking in public forums and at churches and universities about human rights, and recently completed 28 days of ethnographic research in Mauritania and Senegal. Mr. Cotton earned his BA in sociology from Lehman College and is currently a doctoral candidate in social policy at Columbia University. Mr. Jacobs is a co-founder and current research director of the American Anti-Slavery Group, an organization whose intent is to place the issue of slave trade in Africa on the American agenda. He has published numerous articles on the subject and was featured in a PBS series exposing slavery in Sudan and Mauritania, and organized the first anti-abolition sit-in conference in over 130 years last May at Columbia University. He has been blessed for his work by the Black Catholic Bishop of Sudan and cursed for it by followers of the Nation of Islam. Mr. Athié is a Mauritanian diplomat in exile and co-founder of the American Anti-Slavery Group. Before coming to the United States, Mr. Athié held the important position of Chief District Commissioner in South Mauritania and Chief of Staff for a governor in East Mauritania. In the U.S., he has created the Committee for the Defense of Human Rights in Mauritania and now serves as the chairman of the International Coalition. Congressman Dymally is a former congressman, a former colleague, and lieutenant governor of California, and has served as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Africa from 1991 to 1992. He is a member of the U.S. Mauritania Friendship Society and has been an advocate of Mauritania for the past several years. Mr. Dymally has made approximately 25 trips to Mauritania and has published 4 reports on the issue of slavery there, the latest of which he will present to the committee today. We welcome all of you, and if we may begin, Mr. Cotton.
With the chairlady, yo.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, Mr.
I not taking anything away from the other members of the panel, but I certainly would like to offer my personal welcome to, not only as a former distinguished member of this committee, but as subcommittee chairman of the African Subcommittee, also former subcommittee chairman of the International Relations Subcommittee of this committee, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Dymally, whom I have the highest admiration and respect for, and would like to offer that personal welcome to make him feel at home. He's been here in these parts for quite a while, and seeing that he hasn't gotten any white hair, not as much as what he had 20 years ago, but still looks nice and handsome, but certainly would like to offer my welcome to Mr. Dymally for being here.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much. Welcome to all the panelists and Mr. Cotton.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson and members of the subcommittee. I am Samuel Cotton, a PhD candidate in social policy at Columbia University, and I will be reading this statement in a summary fashion, only certain paragraphs to fit into the 5-minute requirement. And the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Slavery in Mauritania and Sudan, Cosmas and I are grateful for this opportunity to testify before the subcommittee about the buying, selling, and breeding of black Africans in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania by Arab Moors, Bedains. Between December 23, 1995 and January 17, 1996, I conducted ethnographic research in Senegal and Mauritania on the practice of slavery, utilizing camera, audio, and video recording devices. Interviews of black Mauritanians in the refugee camps of Njum, Bokadawi, Woroski, and Hokadari provided testimony which supported the charge that slavery is still a way of life in Mauritania and has simply shifted from an overt to a covert practice. I also interviewed Mauritanian refugees in Dakar, and I was also interested in finding out whether Garba Diallo's work, in which he talked about slaves moving from Mauritania across the Senegal River into Senegal, was valid. I did research on that and have documents to prove that small traffic exists. I arrived in Mauritania on January 2nd, 1996, and departed January 12th, 1996. I conducted interviews with the leaders of 2 anti-slavery organizations, Massoud Ould-Boukhar, president of El Hor, and Boubacar Massoud, president of SOS Slave. Both leaders stated that slaves are kept in bondage by a combination of physical restraint, psychological domination, religious manipulation, and the lack of government interest in creating programs that would enable slaves to make the transition to freedom. Boubacar Massoud added that slavery is massive in Mauritania, especially in the countryside, and that there is a traffic in slaves between Mauritania and the Arab immigrant states. To protest the practice of slavery, they've begun to put their articles in the newspapers. That's been mentioned in the testimony. And they've done that to move from a political base to what they consider a legal base, just to let the world know that these things are happening. Haratines and runaway slaves state that the government of Mauritania does not penalize slaves, nor has it created any concrete programs at ending the practice of slavery. I've included in my testimony the case of Fatimatu Mint Rabi Ould Ilai. And she is a child who was taken from her family by a government official and has disappeared into the slave network in Mauritania. This was also published in the newspaper Clam. And for the reasons that there are not these concrete programs or any laws with teeth in them, the Arab population carries on the business of slavery as they have for centuries. The difference is that today, the buying and selling of slaves takes place in the houses of Moors and are private arrangements between Arab families. Open slave markets are clearly a thing of the past. Marriages are arranged, and a strong black male is placed with a strong black female, and the Arab families arranging this marriage divide up the children that are born. Black women are bred many times by different slave men, and the children become the property of the master. When asked in an interview why her master holds her children, the slave woman Atiana Mint Abed Bouli stated, and her picture is right there, she was photographed in a safe house at night where she was hiding from people who've been sent by her master to retrieve her. When I asked her why her master was holding her children, she said, "Because my belly belongs to my master." I also interviewed 4 runaway slaves and 1 freed slave, 1 male and female. Their testimony was recorded. It is important to me that the United States State Department listen to the people in bondage and not the oppressive government of Mauritania. The shift in the language of the State Department from stating that slavery exists to stating that slavery is over and only the vestiges of slavery remains is disturbing. Then there are the attacks in the press on the Mauritanian refugee Mohamed Athié by the United States Ambassador Dorothy Sampas in an effort to improve the image of the Mauritanian government, a government practicing a system of apartheid and guilty as recently as 1991 of the murder of 1,500 of his black citizens, and ethnic cleansing of approximately 100,000 peaceful black citizens. These actions raise both ethical and moral questions for the United States. If slavery is over in Mauritania, when did this great event occur? Who observed the freeing of over 90,000 people? How and with what methods were the slaves informed that they are physically and spiritually free? Where are the interviews that indicate slaves are remaining in bondage only for economical reasons? What provisions for their physical needs were made, food, clothing, and shelter? How were they protected from their masters, recapturing them and returning them to slavery? What governmental or international organization monitored and evaluated the success of what would have to be a stupendous undertaking? Why didn't the Mauritanian government allow the political parties of the Negro Africans and the anti-slavery organizations of the Haratines monitor this major event, since slavery is at the top of their agenda? There aren't any valid answers to these questions because no empirical data, nor any studies conducted by experienced investigators, such as the London-based Anti-Slavery Society, exist, which support the statements of the State Department or Ambassador Dorothy Sampas. The United States was once a slaving nation and participated in the emancipation of millions of Africans. America has historical experience in this area and clearly recognized the need for concrete measures when it created the Freedmen's Bureau of 1865 after it argued for 2 years as to whether or not such an arrangement was necessary. Does the State Department really believe that a system of slavery that began before the American slave trade and has continued to this very day will not require concrete and measurable interventions? The last paragraph simply speaks to the fact that I hope that this change or shift in the Clinton administration's perspective on this country does not continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jacobs?
Yes, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you. It's an honor to appear before you today on behalf of a people most Americans had thought long ago vanished, black chattel slaves. I am Charles Jacobs, the Research Director of the American Anti-Slavery Group, an organization of American and African abolitionists, black and white, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish, who have for 3 years endeavored to place the issue of the present-day slave trade and black slaves on America's national agenda. America is a nation which risked its very existence over the issue of one man owning another, yet as we sit here today in the capital of freedom, black people are in Africa, north and west, being kidnapped and captured. They are bought and sold. They are given as wedding gifts. They are inherited. They are tortured. And as the piece in my testimony shows a picture, they are branded. And indeed, they are bred. The children of raped slaves belong to the master. I'd ask the committee to look at this picture. We have a larger one here. This girl, this was taken by Newsweek photographers in 1992. The girl in the picture must be 11 or 12 years old. She belongs to these men. She serves these men. She is a Mauritanian black Muslim. They are Arabo-Berbers. She will be theirs in every sense of the word. Her children will be their children. Yet there has been to date no direct action on the part of our government to come to these people's aid, even though we have acted in the past in other cases of slavery. For example, if you had sugar in your coffee this morning, we know that this might come from Haitian slaves who are at gunpoint forced to cut cane in the Dominican Republic to this day. President George Bush actually came to the aid of, knowing our history, came to the aid of these Haitians. However, it continues. In addition, in the Clinton crime bill, we made it a crime for United States citizens to travel to foreign soil to pay to have sex with little children who are bought and sold and made into sex slaves. Yet and just last year, when it was discovered that in El Monte, California, Thai nationals had been lured into this country with the false promise of good-paying jobs and were discovered in fortresses surrounded by barbed wire, not permitted to leave, forced to make clothes, for little or no money until they could pay back their masters for their purchase, Secretary of Labor Robert Reich moved immediately to free those slaves and to punish their slave masters. Why then has the United States not acted on the part of the slaves in Mauritania and Sudan? I am by profession a management consultant. I had been in my earlier days an activist in the civil rights movement. I was at Martin Luther King's march. When I met Mohamed Athié and other African exiles, I thought, well, the simple thing to do is to write this up. Everybody knows that it's there. After 50 phone calls to the most prestigious human rights organizations that we know, organizations whose reports have prompted this Congress to act before, Amnesty International, the Anti-Slavery International, Puebla Institute, Human Rights Watch Africa, the United States State Department, the United Nations. I thought simply the task would be to reconvene the anti-apartheid coalition, tell them the story, and that they would reactivate, because after all, slavery in North Africa is certainly no less harmful and disastrous and horrendous than apartheid in South Africa. To that end, we wrote articles and published articles in over 200 black papers in this country. We sent document packages, including photographs of slaves, to many human rights organizations, black organizations, women's groups, human rights organizations I mentioned. We have, I must say, just on a personal note, when you read these reports that are lying, sitting silently in the back of every human rights group's files, you will be very upset. For example, in Mauritania, I'm in public dispute on the pages of the New York Times with our ambassador to Mauritania, Dorothy Sampas, who stated that slavery is virtually ended. I'd like to echo Sam Cotton's question. If it ended, then it was a massive emancipation. What waters were parted. The sound of the chains dropping would have been immense. This just simply didn't happen. In Mauritania, if a slave is, in our own historical language, we would have said uppity, he can be tortured in a variety of ways that are absolutely astounding. And it's difficult to talk about the humiliations of other people, but we have decided to bring this up. There is the camel treatment, by which a camel is deprived of water for several days so that his stomach shrinks. The offending slave is tied to the underbelly of the camel. The camel is then taken to drink. His rapidly expanding stomach pulls the slave apart. There is the insect treatment, whereby an offending slave has desert insects stuffed into his ears, capped off with stones and bound. This drives people mad. I would refer to the picture of in Sudan. As you know, the war is raging. Arab militias, armed by the government of Khartoum, raid African villages. They shoot the men, they capture the women and children. These are kept or sold north. A recently declassified State Department document, the State Department today said that they bring this to light. They do not bring it to light. A declassified State Department document, which was urged to be declassified by Congressman Wolf, says that the slaves, many of them are trucked to Gaddafi's Libya as well. We are, to conclude, we know that this happens. We have to move the debate beyond whether or not slavery exists. This country cannot turn away. We would be shamed were we to turn away. We must act. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobs, for your fine testimony. I'd like to invite Mr. Mohamed Nacir Athié, if he would present his testimony at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to dedicate my testimony to my brothers in bondage in Mauritania and to the blacks who have been suffering for a long time under the dictatorship government of Mauritania, Mauia Ulsid Ahmed Taya. My name is Mohamed Nacir Athié. I'm a Mauritanian diplomat in exile here in the country, in the United States. I'm also the executive director of the International Coalition Against Chattel Slavery. My personal nightmare and that of my family are simply insignificant compared to the daily harassment and abuses hundreds of thousands of human beings are experiencing day in, day out. But first, I would like to say this: God bless the Congress of the United States for calling and holding this critical hearing on slavery in Mauritania and the Sudan. By doing so, you are demonstrating an active interest on the slavery matter. Also, you are showing support for the slave around the world, and in particular, for the slaves in Mauritania and the Sudan. Second, I'm also proud as a Mauritanian half-brother who first benefited of the political asylum status in 1989 in this country to take stand before the Congress of the United States and testify on behalf of our brothers who are still in chains in Mauritania by the Arab Berbers masters. There is more. Maouya will see Ahmed Taya, after seizing power through military plot and appointing himself chairman of the military junta, prime minister, defense minister, has presided over the most systematic violation of human rights and civil rights against the black population living in the South, targeting particularly the half-brother community to which I belong. The evidence of killing, rape, torture of half-brother reached unprecedented height and created a crisis between Senegal and Mauritania. I would like to say now, who are the slaves in Mauritania? The Mauritanian slaves are the product of invasion, raids, and rape of African women. They are called ABD, Anti-Slavery Society, the oldest human rights organization based in London, calculated that, I quote, the country holds a minimum of 100,000 slaves, with a further 300,000 part-time slaves or ex-slaves. This is written in 1982 by John Mercer. No matter how Arab Berbers came into contact with black Mauritanians living in the South, long time ago, events and historical records have demonstrated that most of them were after hunting the slaves. Mr. Chazal, French colonial governor, regulated tax on slaves. He made that agreement with the Arab Berbers in 1932. The Arab Berbers were required to pay for one slave 5 gold, which was the taxation on such animal was 2 francs 50 cents each, which means that an Arab master could pay 12 cents 50 to be free, to just not go to war or something like that. In reports from Africa, Garba Diallo said, I quote, because of the massive sexual exploitation of female slaves by white Arab Berbers masters, the slave population, or Haratin and Abd, has increased to become the largest single ethnic group in the country. Professor Diallo said also that 40% of the population is slave. Slavery today. In his introductory remarks to the Anti-Slavery Society, John Mercer wrote in 1982, and I quote, the head of state from 1960 to 1978, Mokhtar Ould Daddah, who is the first president of Mauritania, kept slaves behind his presidential palace Mohamed Issa Qadari, a Kuwaiti journalist, wrote in the Kuwaiti newspaper Al Watan, April 1989, page 4, I quote, "At the end of my last visit to Mauritania, among the gifts given to me, which I strongly refused by my Arab friends, was a black slave." It is titled, in its report titled Mauritanian Slavery Alive and Well, 10 years after the last abolition, Africa Watch wrote, and I quote again, "Abolishing slavery, which is deeply rooted in Mauritania, is difficult and a long-term problem. Our criticism is not that the Mauritanian government has tried to eradicate slavery, but failed. It did not try at all," says Africa Watch. "We are not aware of any significant practical step taken by successive governments to fulfill the important responsibility Mauritania undertook when it passed laws and ratified international agreements prohibiting slavery. Its persistence is largely explained by the fact that legislative enactments have not been accompanied by initiatives in the economic and social fields." This is 1990. And they say the same thing again in 1994 in their book, which is called the Campaign of Terror. It is a book, Campaign of Terror in Mauritania, 1994. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you for your excellent testimony, and your full statement will be made a part of the record. Mr. Dymally.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Members of the committee, let me thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to address you on this subject. My name is Mervyn Dymally, former member of Congress and former chairman of the Subcommittee on Africa. I'm a legislative advocate for the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. Before I do, Mr. Chairman, let me digress for a moment. I want to make a comment about Ambassador Sampas of U.S. Ambassador Mauritania. As my friend Mr. Falume Vega said, I chaired the Subcommittee on International Relations, had the dubious distinction of being the most prolific traveler in Congress, second only to Mr. Solas. In fact, beat him one year. Visited 41 countries in Africa, served as Congressional Representative to the United Nations, where I met Ms. Sampas. I know of no other ambassador who is as dedicated and committed to their job as Ambassador Sampas. A woman of great integrity, a public servant who is dedicated to the question of reconciliation and diplomacy. And I want to say that she's one of the finest ambassadors, if not the finest, that I have met in the 12 years that I visited every corner of the world and slept in many embassies and had many meals with ambassadors. She's an outstanding public servant and, in my judgment, doing a very good job. The Mauritanian government is pleased to have this opportunity to address this question of the vestiges of slavery in the Republic of Mauritania. Let me say at the outset that no one in Mauritania denies the fact that at one time slavery existed. Ever since independence, Mauritania has moved toward the abolishment of chattel slavery as is known prior to independence. On several occasions, there have been presidential orders, amendments to the Constitution on this subject. The current government has made it abundantly clear that slavery will not be tolerated in Mauritania. Beginning last year, a campaign was initiated across the country, mostly concentrated in the African American media, appealing to African Americans about the question of slavery in Mauritania for obvious reasons. Ever since 1993, I have visited Mauritania on at least 2 occasions every year, and sometimes as many as 4 times a year. Every time I visit,
I raised this question of slavery with the U.S. Embassy, with the palace, and on 2 occasions with the President himself. Each time I've gotten full assurances about the strong commitment to abolishing every vestige of slavery in Mauritania. To show their commitment to the abolishment of this issue, the Mauritanians have sent since 1993, that I know of, 3 delegations, 2 of which I was intimately involved. I took a delegation headed by the President of the Senate, who in American terms would be considered black, to Arizona to meet with Reverend Leon Sullivan and the leadership of the African American Summit. And the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, in his testimony today, made mention of that visit. The purpose of the visit was to convince Americans that the Mauritanians were deeply committed to the elimination of every vestige of slavery. Subsequently, a delegation went to Dakar, Senegal, at the African American Summit headed by Reverend Sullivan. The President of the Mauritanian Senate addressed the problems and possibilities of democracy in Mauritania. Basically, what the President of the Senate said was that colonialism left Mauritania in a desperate state of poverty and illiteracy. Ever since independence, even under military rule, the country has moved forward to eliminate these 2 phenomena, including the vestiges of slavery. More recently, the government received a loan from the World Bank to construct 600 schools, elementary schools in the rural areas of Mauritania, an issue which the President and the Palace have taken a strong interest. The Mauritanians believe that the one way to eliminate any vestige of slavery is through education and economic development, and they're moving swiftly in that direction. In the United States, the Mauritanian Friendship Society has issued 4 reports. Last week, copies of the recent report were circulated to authors and co-authors of H.R. 142 by Mr. Berreiter, and today I have made copies available to members of the subcommittee. The last report was written by an NGO in Mauritania and circulated by the Mauritanian Friendship Society with a brief preface. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, the Mauritanian government wishes to invite members of Congress to travel to Mauritania at any time. They have also asked anti-slavery groups to provide evidence of specific time, place, and names where they believe there is evidence of slavery in Mauritania. Today, one of the witnesses have so named these incidents, and I will take that up with the government. In January of this year, I visited Mauritania on 2 occasions. The first time, I missed a meeting with the rector of the university because he was in Paris. Both he and I considered the meeting so important that I journeyed there the following week to meet him. I subsequently came back to the United States, attempting to seek funds to no avail, and I want to address the question that the chair of the Subcommittee on Africa raised about the absence of funds. I went to the Africa Bureau of USAID to ask for some funds to conduct a conference on democracy, and they said they had no money. I went to the National Democratic Institute. Mauritania is not even on their agenda. And so there is an absence of financial interest in this question of eliminating the vestiges of slavery in Mauritania. Last week, however, I received a letter from the rector that he is proceeding to raise funds for this conference. It is our intention to invite pro-Africa groups and members of Congress to attend this conference. Mr. Chairman, in my brief statement to you, I wish to give you some assurances that the government of Mauritania considers this a very serious matter and is deeply committed to the eradication of all vestiges of slavery. Now, that is not to say that it is within the realm of possibility that this situation may exist and there may not be appearances of slavery. I do not deny that. That is a possibility. But let me conclude by quoting the recent country reports of the United States Department of State, and I quote, "Some freed slaves have either stayed or returned to their former masters and continue to provide labor in exchange for room and board and other basic necessities. Others live independently but continue a symbolic relationship with their former masters, performing occasional paid or unpaid labor in exchange for food, clothing, and Medicare. There are no reliable statistics for the number of Mauritanians who continue to work for the same families for which they worked before the emancipation of 1960, whether as paid or unpaid labor. Reports of cases of involuntary servitude are rare and unconfirmed. Mr. Chairman, I want to make 4 observations which are not included in my written statement. 1, the chair of the Subcommittee on Africa raised the question of the absence of funds to conduct classes and programs and institutes on this question on the part of the United States government, and that is a fact. The chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus made an analogy to the Freedmen Bureau after the end of slavery in the United States, and I have been advocating that, and I think I'm that close to getting the Mauritanian government to respond to that proposal, and I hope this conference that is being proposed this spring in Mauritania will address that subject. 3, the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus in Mauritania would not be black. General Colin, who may very well, Colin Powell, who may very well be the first Republican vice presidential candidate in Mauritania, would not be black. Indeed, his counterpart, the colonel of the army, if you put him next to General Powell, one would ask him if he were from Jamaica. He is not black. So one has to be very careful when you talk about black and color in Mauritania. And finally, I regret very much, because of a miscommunication, Dr. Nina, the former Mauritanian ambassador to the United States, was unable to testify, and I would like to include a statement in the record at some subsequent time. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm disposed to answer any question in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dymally. And to begin the questioning at this point, I would like to note that Mr. Shabbat has now joined us on the subcommittee for these hearings, and we'll yield to him momentarily. One of the concerns that I've been working on behalf of human rights as a member of Congress for 16 years. I've been all over the world, as you have been. I have not been in Mauritania, although I've met with diplomats and talked to people with regards to the issue. Matter of fact, I too was the congressional delegate to the United Nations and raised a number of issues relevant to human rights in Africa when I was there, including what I thought was the unbelievable abuse by General Mengistu when he used food as a weapon and exacerbated what was a famine and used it to hurt people, and we tried to get corridors of tranquility established to get foodstuffs to suffering people. I mention that because you know, we have testimony from very responsible sources here, and the volumes of testimony that continues to come in to both of our subcommittees suggests that indeed slavery continues. It may be just de facto and not de jure, but I have, you know, it has always struck me that in every country that where human rights abuses have been suggested, except with maybe the exceptions of places like North Korea, there's always a law, there's always some cover that the government has. In bilaterals with the Soviets during the 1980s, they always had a convention against, and you just fill in the blank, that they were signatories to UN conventions, for example. They were signers of the Helsinki Final Act, which guaranteed all kinds of rights. They could always trot out their own constitutions and say, look, freedom of religion is enshrined in our own constitution. China does the same thing. They can show you chapter and verse where, on paper, Cuba does it as well, as the gentlelady points out, but the reality is far from the stated beliefs or at least the articulated beliefs in those documents. And now we have testimony by very responsible people who suggest that indeed it is covert in Mauritania. That it's just because of all of the statements made by the government and some, what I would suggest is token efforts. I asked the administration witness earlier how many of those judges lost their jobs, and I think his response was 3 or 4 over the last several years. That's hardly a crackdown on those judges who would deny people their freedom. And he did not have the answer, and perhaps you do, Mr. Dymally, as to how many judges were brought up on charges of not permitting people to be free as they ought to be. I mean, where do we get those statistics? Are they independently verified, or are they just spoon-fed from the government, which raises at least my suspicions, and I think many of other people as well. But how do you respond to the testimony that it's just gone underground, out of sight, out of mind? I mean, how do you independently verify? You are a paid lobbyist for the government of Mauritania. And for the record, if you could state what that salary is, it would be helpful to our deliberations as well.
$120,000.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I am not here in denial. I am here to take the message back to Mauritania. And you have made a very eloquent point. You sound as if you were Dymally in the palace talking, because that's the points that I try to make whenever I go. As an aside, however, you made mention of another country, Ethiopia. I am here pleading for some funds to resurrect the Meek-Leland Home for Boys. Communism have forced people to be orphans at 30 years old, the 30-year war. And so it is a constant battle in Africa. So back to Mauritania, I'm not here to deny or to contradict anyone. I'm simply here to take the message back, and that's what I have been doing since '93 with some consistency. I think the chair of the Africa Subcommittee could tell you that, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus would tell you that I am not here to contradict or to criticize anyone, but simply to listen to what is going on here, take the message back to the president, to the palace, and to give you some assurances that every time I speak with them, they are committed to this question of eliminating slavery in Mauritania.
Do human rights organizations have unfettered access to the country?
Yes, I was recently assured in January that anyone who wishes to come now, they can come. They had one dispute with one organization, the United States, which wanted guarantees to come in, and they felt it was intruding on their sovereignty. But Freedom House just left there. I think they were there in either January or February.
If a slave comes forward with testimony, which obviously would, and we heard Dr. Jacobs describe some of the methods that have been chronicled by Human Rights Watch Africa about what is done to those people who step out of line, and he mentioned a third in his testimony that is absolutely despicable. If people come forward and tell these groups and representatives of human rights organizations, do you have any fear whatsoever that there will be repercussions visited upon those people?
No, in fact, I've discussed this issue with the embassy. They invited members of the opposition, members of the media. I raised that issue. Would they join in an effort to help groups from the United States? And their response was favorable.
What I'm getting at is that as these people come forward and out of a household where they are literally captive, what happens when they tell their story and then have to go back to that house?
Well, there have not been very many stories to the government.
Torture works.
As far as I know.
My experience has always been that people are hindered by the grave implications of what might happen to them, which again has been chronicled by many of the human rights groups. Is it your testimony that there's no torture by government or by a privatized method of torture where...
My testimony is that the government has told me, and the embassy has told me, there is no torture.
Can you independently verify that?
I'm sorry?
Apart from the government and our own embassy, which is at odds with testimony that is here today, can you independently verify that through your own sources?
No. Except the word that I've got from both sources.
From those two sources?
Yeah.
Mr. Cotton, did you want to respond to that?
There is only one way to really respond to this, and that is we need to have a clear understanding of this country and what's going on. And I respond to it by saying that their dialogue is very clever, because when I do a content analysis of the literature, they've moved from slavery itself to the vestiges. And what's curious is that they've eliminated a class that's in that country in the discussion. There are 4 classes that I took a note of when I was in that country. They're the Negro Africans who are holding on to their African culture and their heritage. And they call themselves Negro Africans for that reason. 2, There are the Haratines. Those are the ones you'll see in the discussion. These are the ones they discuss that go in and out, that they might listen to their master or they might not. That's the Haratine class. But the class that's not discussed is always the mythical or the mystery, the missing 90,000. They are called Abid, plural Abid. This 90,000 is not accounted for in any of their discussions. However, the cases that he's talking about being brought to the government are abundant. I have pictures of 4 of them. They're right there. In terms of the State Department, I have a contract of 1992. This particular contract deals with the racial nature. This is an Islamic country, but they buy and sell black Muslim people, which means, as from the dialogue with people, that these are subhuman people, which allows them to buy and sell them with religious impunity. So a selective morality kicks in. That's why this government can carry on like this with a clear conscience, because the people they buy and sell are not humans. The contract opens, if I might read that to the record. This is for 1992 in the Islamic year 1412, the month of Hijjah. In the name of Allah, most gracious and most merciful, salutations and peace upon him. They will cite the name of the people and the family name so that the government, if they were interested, could trace it. Muhammad Val Oud Nima, son of Sidiba, brought from Muhammad Liman Oud Sidi Muhammad, son of Talib Ibrahim, a slave with her daughter named Kiniba, in the price of 50,000 ugia, received entirely by the seller from the buyer. Therefore, it becomes effective his property of the 2 slaves listed. The 2 parties did receive my witness, and the buyer accepted before the hidden defects of the slaves. The contract was made at the end of the month of Hijjah of the year 1412 or 1992 by this judge or religious figure, Abdrabu Mutali Ud Muhammad Adrahmain, son of Beru. God forgive me and my father and all the believers. This picture is the woman and the child in the contract, can be contacted in Nutshuk through the head of El Hor, which is not recognized by the government, and she can be worked with because they are fighting in court with this contract. This is the contract, this is its translation in French. The buying and selling of people goes on and on. All of these individuals have a pattern that you see in the film. And that particular pattern is that once that woman runs, many times she's permitted to run. Some of the reasons for that permission have to do with if he doesn't feel like carrying her weight in his household, but he has babies, so he has fresh slaves, so he'll let her go, knowing that the government does not have any programs. When I find them living in the streets and in barracks in Nutshuk, starving, and carrying all sorts of labor trying to stay alive, like buzzards, their masters know where they are, trace them through other slaves, and they show up. Give me your babies then. You're hungry. Why don't you come back and work? These are Haratines going in and out, and runaway slaves. The Abid, the slave class, is in slavery and has the mentality, as it's been called many times in discussion, that of a donkey. This is important to understand. A donkey mind. I asked individuals, and they talked about how a donkey is tied outside of a building, and he doesn't go anywhere. You can beat his flanks red, splay them, but he doesn't move. These individuals are raised from birth when they're bred. They are told that the way to paradise is under the foot of their master. This class of people stay in the far countries or are shipped out of the country. No studies have been done that can be produced, whereas there was a government organization that went to these Bedouins, tents, highly mobile people who carry their slaves from one place to the next, interviewed them, told them what was happening. So that's my response. My response is, if he went to anti-slavery organizations who are not acknowledged, they have cases upon cases, they produce the people, they produce the pictures, but this is not what's interested. That's my response.
Would either of you 2 gentlemen would like to respond as well?
Yes, I would like to add this. I have on my hand here a petition that is written by some refugees, Mauritanian refugees, against Ms. Dorothy Sampas, who is a U.S. ambassador in Mauritania. And this petition is addressed to the President of the United States. If Mauritania was at war, and it is, these slave masters would be today tried, and we will call a tribunal for them, an international tribunal. There is two kinds of crime against humanity in Mauritania. First, the slavery issue. And I'm sorry to see Mr. Dymally, whom I met twice, giving some kind of smooth response to the issue of slavery in Mauritania. There is slavery. It's not like slavery. It looks like it's slavery. The buying and the selling of people, human beings, who deserve to have the basic human rights everybody has. As long as people do not speak up and try to end this evil practice in this country, and unfortunately, it's going on in most of Arabic countries. Whether we like it or not, I'm a Muslim and I'm proud to be. This issue is going on in most Arabic countries.